Good evening. Tonight, we turn our attention to one of the most controversial housing debates now emerging in New York City politics. Recent comments and public remarks from New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani regarding landlords for housing violations and possible seizures of neglected rental properties have now ignited fierce debates across the city. The proposal, or at minimum the rhetoric surrounding it, centers around a growing frustration many New Yorkers feel regarding deteriorating house conditions, unresolved violations, and landlords who critics say continue collecting rent while tenants allegedly endure unsafe living conditions. Mandami has argued that landlords who continuously fail to maintain habitable properties could potentially face the seizure of those buildings, while management or ownership transferred to what he describes as responsible stewards. Now, to many frustrated tenants, that idea sounds long overdue, but to others, it raises serious constitutional, economic, and political concerns. Tonight, we examine both sides of the debate because while housing neglect is real, questions surrounding government power are real too. Let us begin with the argument supporters are making. There is absolutely no denying that some New York City tenants have endured unacceptable conditions inside rental housing. Broken heating systems during winter months, persistent mold, water leaks, rodent infestation, unsafe electric systems, elevators repeatedly out of service, and in some cases, violations have remained unresolved for extended periods of time. Tenants advocate argue many residents feel trapped, especially lower income renters who may not possess the financial ability to relocate elsewhere. Supporters of strong enforcement measures argue that housing is not simply an investment vehicle. It is where families live, where children sleep, where elderly residents depend on safe conditions. And supporters argue that if a landlord continuously fails to maintain safe living conditions while still collecting rent, then the government intervention becomes necessary. From their perspective, severe and chronic neglect should carry serious consequences, including potentially the loss of ownership rights. And politically speaking, that message resonates with many renters across New York City. But this is where the debate becomes significantly more complicated because critics argue that once government expands its authority to seize private property, the potential for abuse grows dramatically. Opponents of Mandami's rhetoric warn that inspection departments could become politicized, and that concern centers around one key question: who decides when the landlord has failed enough to justify seizure? Critics argue New York City already possesses an enormous regulatory bureaucracy, and many property owners already complain about inconsistent enforcement, excessive violations, mounting compliance costs, bureaucratic delays. Some landlords fear that politically motivated enforcement could eventually emerge, where certain owners become targeted while others receive preferential treatment. Others worry that small landlords, especially family owned buildings, could become disproportionately vulnerable compared to large institutional properties owned with vast legal resources. Critics also warn that aggressive seizure policies could discourage investments in already suffering neighborhoods, because if investors believe ownership rights are unstable, capital eventually leaves, and when capital leaves, buildings often deteriorate even faster. Another major issue frequently left out of this conversation is the impact of New York City's rent stabilization laws. Supporters of rent stabilization argue those protections remain essential in one of the most expensive housing markets in America. Without them, many working class families could face displacement or homelessness. But critics argue that decades of expanding regulations have also made it increasingly difficult for landlords, particularly smaller landlords, to fund major repairs and long-term building improvements, especially in older buildings. Many owners argue rising insurance premiums, labor costs, utility expenses, tax, and maintenance costs continue climbing rapidly, while rental income growth remains heavily restricted under stabilization rules. Following major tenant protection reforms passed in Albany in 2019, some landlords argued their ability to recover renovations and capital improvement costs became more limited. Critics say that creates a dangerous financial imbalance. Aging infrastructure, escalating repair costs, restricted revenue growth, and mounting violations. Now, to be fair, none of that excuses neglect property owners, but opponents of aggressive seizure policies argue policymakers cannot simultaneously suppress revenue, increase operating costs, and then act shocked when buildings begin to deteriorate. Some housing analysis warn that New York risks pushing smaller landlords towards insolvency, abandonment, or foreclosure. And if enough owners leave the market entirely, the city housing shortage could become even worse. But perhaps the single most uncomfortable question surrounding this debate is involving New York City itself. Because the largest landlord in New York City is not a private corporation, it is the New York City Housing Authority, NASHA, and for years, NASHA has forced criticism over deteriorating living conditions, unresolved maintenance complaints, infrastructure failures, mold issues, elevator outages, and massive repair backlogs. Public reporting and agency data have documented enormous numbers of active work orders that remain unresolved throughout the public housing system. And that reality creates a difficult political question for advocates of aggressive property seizure policies. If unsafe living conditions justify government interventions against private landlords, then should the same standards apply to government-owned housing? If NYCHA tenants remain trapped inside buildings suffering from unresolved violations, should city-controlled housing itself be placed under outside control? Should independent management take over certain developments? Should federal oversight expand further? Critics argue that if the principle truly centers around protecting tenants, then government must first hold itself to the same standards it seeks to impose on private owners. And politically, that may become one of the most difficult questions surrounding Mamdani's housing rhetoric moving forward. At its core, this debate reflects a much larger ideological divide emerging across America's major cities. One side increasingly views housing as a social right requiring aggressive government intervention. The other believes expanding government controls over private property creates a long-term economic and constitutional dangers. Supporters of strong intervention argue markets alone have failed too many renters. Critics argue excessive government intervention helps create many of the underlying problems now being blamed on landlords. And somewhere in the middle sits the ordinary New Yorker, tenants searching for safe housings, landlords struggling with rising costs, neighborhoods trying to survive economic pressures from every direction. There is no question New York City faces a serious housing crisis. There is no question some tenants are living in unacceptable conditions. And there is no question negligent landlords should face consequences. But there are also legitimate concerns surrounding how much government power should possess when it comes to private property. Because once seizure power expands, the lines between accountability and political weaponization can become dangerously thin. And before New York City begins discussing taking privately owned housing away from landlords, many residents may first ask whether City Hall should address the ongoing conditions inside the housing system the government already controls. If the city cannot fully manage its own housing infrastructure, some New Yorkers may reasonably wonder whether expanding government control is truly the answer. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News, and that has been my take. Good night.